Writer, director, editor Neil Marshall has been a fan of horror ever since he was a kid. One night when he was about 5, he watched Frankenstein with his father, and it changed his life forever. He grew up in Newcastle in England, and after seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark when he was 11, he started making home movies on a Super 8 camera. As he got older, he dreamed of becoming a director. When he was young, his family used to go on holiday in the Highlands of Scotland. He always felt it was a country full of beauty, as well as an underlying menace, especially on these supernaturally dark and stormy days. He thought this would be the perfect location for something wild and ferocious to go running around. In the late 1980s, he went to film school at Newcastle Polytechnic, where he met Keith Bell. They both graduated the media production course and stayed friends. In 1995, Marshall and Bell worked on the action thriller Killing Time. It was a super low-budget film where most were working for free just to get the experience. Working as the cinematographer on Killing Time was Sam McCurdy, who also was from Newcastle. McCurdy and Marshall were fans of Sam Raimi and would have long discussions about how they wanted to make their Evil Dead. One night, Marshall and Bell were on vacation and stopped in a pub in the Highlands of Scotland. Late into the evening, they were both fairly drunk and talking movie ideas. Both Marshall's father and grandfather were in the military, so he grew up listening to stories about the military. He wanted to make a cool monster movie and felt there weren't very many good werewolf movies. Every other day there was a vampire film, but werewolves were woefully underused. Marshall suggested making a film about soldiers versus werewolves. They both loved the concept, but had no idea how they were going to make it. As the night rolled on, Bell wrote a contract on a napkin saying he'd produce the film, and Marshall would direct. They both signed. After sobering up, they decided they'd stay true to the contract and make this film happen. The duo then formed Northmen Productions, in the hopes of making their own films. Marshall wrote the first draft of the Soldiers vs. Werewolf script in 1996 and called it Dog Soldiers. It was a rough idea of soldiers fighting werewolves in the Highlands of Scotland. Most werewolf movies revolved around a person dealing with the werewolf curse. With this, they wanted to make a siege movie that involved werewolves. They had their concepts, and now they had to figure out where they were going to get their funding. Things were rough with very little interest. They were put in touch with the Victor Film Company. Victor Films was the company that at the time produced the Stephen Norrington sci-fi horror film Death Machine. Victor Film put them in touch with Christopher Figg, who was the producer of the Hellraiser movies. They thought he would be a good fit for the film. With the funding they had, they were able to work on some pre-production. Marshall was introduced to production designer Simon Bowles. Figg suggested Bob Keane for the special effects, who he worked with on Hellraiser. Keane had done werewolves before in Waxwork and Nightbreed, but never worked on a werewolf movie. Marshall didn't want CG. He said the industry had never been able to get hair and fur right, and everything from Anaconda to The Mummy looks too much like a video game cartoon. An American Werewolf in Paris had a $25 million budget, and the CG werewolves were not the best. So the decision was made to do all the effects in camera. The design Marshall had in mind was unlike any werewolf that had been seen in movies previously. Bowles worked with Keane and Dave Bonnywell to design what they called Big Kick-Ass Werewolves. They created the concept for these giant 8-foot-tall beasts on their hind legs that could also run on all fours. They wanted them to be thin and flexible, so they designed them with the intention of hiring dancers to wear the suits while wearing stilts. The team did conceptual drawings and even some maquettes of the werewolves. They took their concepts to every studio in the UK and were turned down by every single one. It seemed the general notion was that the film was far too ambitious for a first-time director. The other was that many of the studios claimed this wasn't the kind of film they made anymore. At the time, in the late 90s in the UK, horror movies weren't commercially viable. They only wanted romantic comedies or dramas. They were slightly discouraged but not given up. As a way to help entice studios, they worked on casting the film. Figg suggested casting Kevin McKidd for the role of Cooper. He worked with him on Trainspotting and thought he might like this as a change of pace to the other productions he was being offered. Unfortunately, he had a scheduling conflict and wouldn't be able to make the shoot. They then hired an unknown English actor, Jason Statham, for the role. Marshall knew of actor Liam Cunningham from his many roles as a villain in both TV and movies. They offered him the role of the evil Captain Ryan, which he took. Sean Pertwee heard about Dog Soldiers through Jason Isaacs while he worked on Event Horizon. This worked out great because Marshall envisioned Pertwee as Sergeant Wells. Marshall sent Pertwee a copy of the script, and he loved it. They didn't have the funding at the time, but Pertwee told him he would make sure he was available whenever they finally did. Over the course of months of trying to get funding, they had a few deals lined up, but they all fell through. Statham dropped out of the production because he got the role in the John Carpenter film Ghosts of Mars. They liked the TV series Spaced and offered the role of Spoon to Simon Pegg. Pegg loved the idea, but had already promised Edgar Wright he'd star in his first film, a little movie called Shaun of the Dead. With no interest in the UK, the producers suggested taking it to the American film market. The AFM is an annual event that takes place every November in Santa Monica, California. The event's attended by film industry people from around the globe, looking to network, buy, sell, and acquire films. Marshall and his team brought the script and all the materials they had for Dog Soldiers in the hopes of finding someone who would be interested in funding the production. They did in the most unusual way. While they were there, it caught the attention of spinach tycoon David Allen. He was visiting the AFM, and the concept art from Dog Soldiers caught his eye. He always wanted to make a werewolf movie, so he decided to help them finance the film. So the team got lucky, and David Allen's Arkansas-based film company, Kismet Entertainment, would fund the production. They reached out to Kevin McKidd again, and since he was done with his other project, he was now able to join the Dog Soldiers team. Pertwee was on holiday with his wife, and received a phone call about the movie. It had been 2 years since he was cast, but he was happy they got their funding and was looking forward to the shoot. In the 90s, Marshall shot a short film called Combat. There was an actress he really liked named Emma Cleesby, who he wanted to hire, but she wasn't available at the time. Now at Dog Soldiers, he was able to bring her in for the role of Megan. They filled out the cast with other actors, most of which were relative newcomers. Now it was 2001, 6 years since they first started working on the film, and finally they had their budget and were able to move closer to filming. They had a budget of around £2.3 million, which was relatively low budget for what they wanted to accomplish. Marshall had a specific intention for the movie. It wasn't a werewolf movie with soldiers, it was a soldier movie with werewolves. That way he was able to focus on the characters of the soldiers, instead of just making them cannon fodder for the monsters. He wanted to be a realistic portrayal of British squatties, with the addition of the fantasy element of the werewolves. The special effects team had 12 weeks to design and build the werewolves. Since they had so much time, the team was able to consume as much werewolf-related material as possible to discuss what they liked and disliked. They used that to make a very lean, dirty, and completely different type of werewolf. Like Marshall wanted, they hired dancers to be in the suits. He wanted the werewolves to be muscular but skinny, and able to have graceful movements. The designers took molds and made suits for the dancers. With the stilts, the wolves stood over 7.5 feet tall. Marshall had been writing and rewriting the film over the years, so by the time they were finally ready to film, he was on either the 17th or 18th draft of the script. Also, as a way to save money, the decision was made to shoot the film in 16mm instead of 35. The film was much cheaper, and the money they saved could be used elsewhere in the production. Marshall made sure to hire Sam McCurdy to be the director of photography, since they were finally making their Evil Dead. The film was supposed to take place in the Highlands of Scotland, but it was far too expensive to film there, so they began looking for alternatives. They were searching for places to film and settled in Luxembourg, which was a very solid substitute for the real location. The reason being there were enough locations they could film that looked very similar to Scotland, and, most importantly, there was a fantastic tax deal they had in place, which made this the ideal place to shoot and save money. Beyond that, there was also a studio facility in Luxembourg that gave them access to space to build sets, as well as an international crew. They built an exterior set of the house where most of the film would take place. Since they were only shooting the front and side, as a way to save money, they only built the front and side. The interiors were to be filmed on a set back in the studio. They designed the interior sets to help give the werewolves a proper scale. With these 7.5 foot tall monstrosities having to hunch over to fit in the rooms, it made them look all that more imposing. The werewolf suits were not easy to wear, and they had to take breaks from standing on the stilts. They also had problems with movement. When they ran, they'd often fall over. They wanted the actors to be somewhat believable as soldiers, so they put them through a brief training. They couldn't afford to send them to boot camp, so they hired a former French Foreign Legion instructor as a military advisor. He spent a few days with the cast, running them through drills and gave them a crash course in weapon training. They planned on doing a 5-week shoot, 2 weeks on location, and 3 in the studio. They filmed the movie in order because it was the most cost-efficient way to do things. At the end of the film, they're essentially going from room to room destroying the house. It would have been too expensive to do it out of order, since they'd have to rebuild the set every time they destroyed it. Now that they had everything in place, it was time to start filming. Marshall was incredibly nervous when they started filming. He said he was terrified the first time he yelled action. The first day of filming, they did a scene where the soldiers would be jumping out of a helicopter and running for cover. They didn't want the actors to jump out of the helicopter, and they didn't have stunt doubles. Some of the crew offered to be geared up to do the jump. The crew was all from Luxembourg, which required all men to be in the military, so they already had proper training. They jumped from the helicopter with no problem. All the actors then ran and got into position on the ground. Kevin McKidd was really excited, and a little too into his role. He ran across the terrain, turned, and jumped down into position. The problem was, he forgot his uniform had a metal plate in it, so when he came down, the plate mashed into his chest and broke a rib. This was day one. Since it was early in the filming, McKidd was afraid they'd send him to the hospital and recast his part. He really believed in the film, so he didn't tell anybody about it and just dealt with the pain. After a few weeks, he couldn't take it anymore and told the director, who immediately sent him to the hospital. They wrapped him up and Marshall told him he should have just come forward when it happened. He wouldn't have replaced him unless he was out of commission and couldn't film. Filming on location was difficult because the weather messed up their schedule. Sometimes it rained, which made the areas they worked on slick and difficult to film. A few times it snowed, which screwed up continuity. On the days when it rained, the actors and the crew kept slipping in the mud. On the days when it snowed, they had to move their production to the inside of the barn and shot what they could there. For example, the scene inside the transport was supposed to be outside, but they filmed it in the barn with the crew rocking the vehicle. Somewhere along the way, one of the producers changed the name of the film to Night of the Werewolf. Marshall thought this was a terrible idea and protested. Unfortunately, since the producer was the one with all the money, he called the shots, and the director was overruled. Later, a reporter was writing about the film and was extremely positive about everything except the title. For such a unique film, having a generic title like Night of the Werewolf was a terrible idea. The producer saw this and thankfully let them change it back to Dog Soldiers. Marshall wanted the film to be a dark comedy, so there were some intentionally funny moments. The humor comes from the characters reacting to the situation. It's done in a way that's not forced and never is a tool to deflate the tension. It's not a wink at the camera to mock the situation, which would have veered the whole thing into a farce. Instead, it takes itself just seriously enough, and the humor comes naturally, which is why it works. Later in the film, Sergeant Wells was supposed to have a few drinks to help numb the pain from being ripped open. They were going to use crazy glue to seal his wounds. During the Vietnam War, cyanoacrylate, or crazy glue, was proven valuable to military surgeons. Under battlefield conditions, they used it to stop bleeding and even close wounds. Today it's used in specific formulas developed for medical use. The sergeant's in too much pain and wants Cooper to knock him out. To help him get into character for the scene, Pertwee had a few drinks. McKidd punched him and was supposed to miss, but accidentally clipped and broke his nose. Pertwee joked that he was being obnoxious since he was drunk and thought McKidd hit him on purpose. McKidd swears that's not the case and that it was a total accident. For the big werewolf transformation late in the movie, Marshall knew they couldn't show it. There was no way they could compete with great transformations like An American Werewolf in London and The Howling, so they decided to sidestep the whole procedure. Growing up, one of Marshall's favorite movies was Carry On Screaming. He decided to do the transformation as an homage to that. The actor would have contacts and prosthetic hands, he would go out of frame, and would return as the werewolf. It was a cheat, but if done properly, it was an effective cheat. Bob Keane worked on Event Horizon. For the scene in the basement with the corpses, they reused some prop corpses from Event Horizon. They just dressed them up in military uniforms. The house they blew up was a scale model. The night vision footage was just black and white footage they shot during the day. Darren Moffat, who played Spoon, was an ex-boxer. For his final duel with the werewolves, they had him square off like a boxer and get some good shots in before being eviscerated. The movie's littered with references and homages. Everything from Goldilocks to Assault on Precinct 13 to The Matrix.
The spoon! There is no spoon.
Even some more obvious ones like Corporal Bruce Campbell and Sergeant Harry G. Wells, or H.G. Wells. It's implied the meat in the stew was human. One of the soldiers suggests that it's pork. Long pig is Polynesian for human flesh eaten by cannibals. As a bit of foreshadowing, Marshall designed the patches the soldiers wore. They were a wolf's head with a dagger through it. Captain Ryan is killed at the end with his silver dagger. On the last day of filming, they wrapped early. The crew went to Marshall and said since they had the time, was there any other shots he'd like? He thought for a moment and said, "Can we blow up a werewolf head?" So they took one of them, loaded it with fake blood and explosives, and they also took a helicopter over the mountains of Scotland for a day to pick up some additional footage they could use to establish location. While shooting was difficult, everyone had fun. The soldiers bonded and really got into the spirit of what they were making. They could just feel they were working on something special. After filming, they took the footage back to Newcastle for the post-work. Having an extensive background in editing, Marshall edited the film himself. They did order one CG effect, and that was for Megan's eyes when she transformed. In the script Marshall had written, it ended with Cooper's story being a side note in a tabloid paper, with a much bigger story of the football score. Originally it was written as England 5, Germany 0. While they were shooting the movie, England did go against Germany, and the score was England 5, Germany 1. So they used the official score. The film was edited and they went looking for a distributor. The producers were worried about finding someone to buy the film in the US, so they sold it to the first offer they received, which was from the Sci-Fi Channel. Sci-Fi then released it on TV as one of their sci-fi originals. Most had no idea Sci-Fi had nothing to do with it, aside from being lucky enough to get the rights for cheap. If you look at one of their usual Sci-Fi originals, and then compare it to Dog Soldiers, there is a noticeable difference in quality. The film got a theatrical release in most of the world in 2002. Since it was shot in 16mm, they had the print blown up to 35 so it could be shown in theaters. While the film was self-contained, Marshall still had ideas for the future, one of which was to have a sequel where Cooper gets admitted to an asylum. They also admit the camper from the beginning, who we never see die, and he turns into a werewolf during the first full moon. So here we have a soldier versus a werewolf in an insane asylum. A lot of potential there. Another idea was to turn this into a trilogy, where Cooper's battling other supernatural creatures. This is suggested earlier in the film when Megan's talking about the werewolves.
Those things out there are real. And if they're real, what else is real?
He said he's frequently asked by fans about a sequel. He tells them he doesn't own the rights to the film, so whatever happens, he doesn't have a say in the matter. David Allen, the spinach tycoon, is the owner of the rights, so whatever happens with it is up to him. In 2004, Allen tried to do a direct sequel called Dog Soldiers: Fresh Meat. It was going to be filmed in Luxembourg or Canada. It was set to be directed by Andy Armstrong, the award-winning stuntman who went on to become a director. The production stalled but continued to be discussed until about 2008, when it was removed from the production company Kismet's website. While Dog Soldiers was not too well known in the US, it did well in the UK and helped jumpstart Marshall's career as a director. He followed this up with the brilliant The Descent, the post-apocalyptic action film Doomsday, and just recently he directed the Hellboy reboot, which I heard had a lot of behind-the-scenes troubles. Allen financed other films under his Kismet brand, mostly horror like Boo, Cemetery Gates, and Death Valley. There was a pilot for a potential TV series made called Dog Soldiers Legacy. It was never picked up. In 2014, Allen announced they were working on a prequel and a different sequel, but nothing has surfaced on either. Dog Soldiers got a release on DVD, but the quality wasn't the best. Then it was later released on Blu-ray, but it was a very muddy print. Shout Factory wanted to restore the film for their Blu-ray line, and Marshall was more than happy to get involved and help out. Shortly before its Blu-ray release, Shout Factory put a message out from Marshall on their Facebook timeline. At last, the new Blu-ray of Dog Soldiers is here, and I'm very proud of it. It's been quite a struggle to put it all together, but I was adamant that this needed to be a new, upgraded transfer of the movie, the best it could possibly be. Little did I realize how tricky this was going to prove. It seems the original negative has long since vanished, but I managed to track down a couple of the last surviving prints from the UK. It's terrifying to think that without this new HD master, all that would remain of Dog Soldiers would be a few DVDs, and the previous lackluster Blu-ray release. And it's not even that old. Independent movies like this need to be archived and preserved, or they risk being lost forever. The Blu-ray was released, and there was an unforeseen pushback against the film over the quality of the print, or lack thereof. Marshall followed up his previous post with a much longer one. It seems myself and Scream Factory are experiencing some major flack regarding the Dog Soldiers Blu-ray release, so I figure I should fill in a bit of the background here. First of all, I wholeheartedly support the Scream Factory release. The previous Blu-ray was made without any involvement from me, and I remember when it came out, the general consensus was that the picture quality was not great. All credit to Scream Factory for wanting to involve the filmmaker in this process as much as possible. When they first announced this Blu-ray release last year, the original plan was to work with me to create a whole bunch of original extras based on new interviews with all the key cast and crew, but that the movie itself would essentially be the same version as last time. I asked them to delay the release because I felt we could do better for the fans and try to track down some of the original film elements to make a fresh HD transfer. Since the movie never received a theatrical release in the US, although I believe it was screened at the Egyptian for a week, I knew we'd have to turn to the UK to find the best possible elements available. What I didn't know was that after an exhaustive search, I discovered the original negative was nowhere to be found. Neither the UK producer, distributor, or film processing lab had any idea where the negative is. Without it, we simply could not achieve the kind of high-quality HD transfer I would have wished to deliver. Instead, we managed to get a hold of 2 original cinema prints, and despite being 13 years old and having a few scratches here and there, they represent the most accurate version of the original theatrical release that we could. However, as close as they are, they're just cinema prints, and in terms of color timing for the new Blu-ray, we were limited to the parameters of the print itself. Which means in basic terms, if the contrast is high on the print and the blacks are crushed, as indeed they are, then there is no more visual information to be gained from them. You can't brighten up the image and see what's hidden in the darkness like you can when you're working from the negative or from digital. All that'll happen is the black will turn to gray and just give the movie a washed out flat look. Because, let's not forget, this movie was shot on 16mm and blown up to 35mm. So under no circumstances was a Blu-ray of this movie ever going to look as smooth and pristine as a movie shot on 35mm or any of the high-res digital formats we use today. In fact, transferring it to HD actually highlights the grain just as it does any other detail. So this version inherently looks more grainy than before. It's unavoidable, unless you have the money to do a full restoration and cleanup, but then again, you need the negative for that. So is this version of Dog Soldiers the best it could ever be? No. Of course not. If we had the negative and a shitload of cash, we could have done a lot better. Is it the best it could be under the circumstances? Yes. Will it appeal to everybody? No, but that's movies for you. At the end of the day, everybody involved, myself included, put in a lot of work to give the fans a Blu-ray worth forking out their hard-earned cash for. And nobody involved, myself included, got paid anything for doing it. There are no royalties, ancillaries, or anything else. This is not an attempt to exploit the fans. It was, on my part, an attempt to give the fans something new and unique, and not simply a repackaged version of what's already out there. When I started working on this, the Scream Factory Blu-ray was the best version out there. It seems that recently there was a German 4K Blu-ray release. The quality's improved, although I'm not entirely sure how they can do a 4K release of a film shot on 16mm. To be fair though, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre received a 4K remaster for its 40th anniversary, and that, like Dog Soldiers, was shot on 16mm, though they were able to pull from the original negatives, which is how they were able to clean it up as best they could. For Dog Soldiers, unfortunately I couldn't get any info on the source they pulled this from. I'm assuming they must have gotten lucky and found the original negatives. That's really the only explanation. This release also came out 5 years after the Shout Factory Blu-ray, so it's not like it popped up overnight. Dog Soldiers is one of the best werewolf movies out there. Even though it's really a siege movie with werewolves, you could replace the werewolves with something like zombies, and while it would be a similar film, it wouldn't be anywhere as good. The two halves work perfectly together, and each part is what helps the film stand out from the pack. The mixture of soldier movie with werewolves is what makes it better. Much like Marshall wanted, it's not your usual werewolf movie. It's a platoon of rookie soldiers who are fighting something that nothing could have ever trained them for. Not even a good kick to the nards will stop a werewolf. Dog Soldiers was a labor of love and showed what Neil Marshall could do. He spent 6 years making this happen, and has a film that he is very proud of. McKidd said making Dog Soldiers was one of the happiest and most creative shoots he's ever had the privilege to be a part of. The other actors all agreed. They should be proud. Everyone involved took what could have been another tired monster film and made it into something special. While Marshall said he had some disagreements with Allen over the way the film was handled, he'll forever be in his debt for funding the production. He may not have agreed with some of his decisions, but without him, it would have never been made in the first place. I'm sad Marshall wasn't able to make the Werewolf in an Asylum movie. That has the potential to be really great. It's a more closed environment, and would lean more into the horror side of things than Dog Soldiers did. Plus, Cooper's a very interesting character. It would have been cool to see what they would have done with him. The trilogy idea had more potential to be a moneymaker, but I feel it wouldn't have been as interesting as a sequel. Having Cooper fighting other monsters like vampires would take away some of the uniqueness the first one tried so hard to create. Plus, what would you call it? Since Cooper's the only survivor, would it be Dog Soldier? Dog Soldiers 2, the one with vampires. Or how about this? Dog Soldiers. Oh shit, mummies!
And all we can do is let nature take its course.
They were always here. I just unlocked the door.
It's that time of the month.